Great. Okay. So as a start, can you please just say and spell your name?
Sure. My name is William Deresiewicz, although I encourage people to call me Bill. William, Deresiewicz.
Great. And here you can be as elaborate as you'd like, but can you give me a kind of a thumbnail autobiographical sketch of your own travels through the world of higher education?
Okay. My dad was a professor of engineering at Columbia. I was a Columbia faculty brat, which among other things meant that I was destined to go to Columbia College from the moment I was conceived. I went from 81 to 85. I was a biopsych major, and I could talk about how I managed to make such an enormous mistake. This was the 80s. I didn't know what I wanted to do with myself, so I applied to law schools and decided not to go. And almost as a way of not going to law school, I went to journalism school at Columbia. It was just a one-year program. That would have been 86, 87. Did a couple of jobs and then realized that I needed to study English, which is what I should always have studied. I applied to PhD programs, got rejected from most of them. Columbia accepted me because it had this truly insane policy of accepting 70 people into the PhD program, throwing half of them out at the end of the first year. It was really quite a supportive environment. And then, fortunately, my second year, I ran into Karl Kroeber, the great Karl Kroeber, my professor. I did my dissertation under him. It took me 9 years, 5 of which I was teaching as a graduate instructor. And then I got a job here at Yale in 98 and spent 10 years on the faculty. At the time, you could spend 10 years without getting tenure. So I was an untenured associate for the last 4 years, and I spent 4 years trying to get my next job, and I didn't manage to succeed in getting my next job, so I had to leave the academy in 2008, and I've been a full-time writer ever since. Without my having foreseen that this would be the case, I've ended up writing about higher education, among other things.
Okay. And can you talk about... I want to get into the substance of your work on education, but can you first talk a little bit about the genesis of it? What was the kind of path you took from beginning to think about it to actually producing a book on the subject?
Right, yes. I had been thinking about what I was seeing among my students, talking about it with fellow faculty members when I was a junior faculty member. The students seemed programmed in a certain way, but it wasn't even the discussions with faculty students and with faculty members. I was the kind of professor who made himself available to students to talk to. Students knew that they could talk to me about things. I didn't force them to, but I would make time to ask them about themselves. And a lot of them expressed to me a feeling of, not being sure what to do with their lives, but also my smarter ones, I would say smarter, but my more intellectually engaged ones often said that they felt that the university wasn't really serving their purposes very well. So I had this kind of collection of complaints in this direction, and I planned to write an essay about it. I did, as it happened, St. A's, the sort of semi-secret society here, asked me to give a talk in the fall of 2007, and I used it to preview these ideas, and so that was the first incarnation. And then the following summer, which coincidentally was literally the last fortnight of my contract at Yale, the piece came out as a magazine article that I called "The Disadvantages of an Elite Education." The title suggests a number of things, but one thing might suggest that it was a bit of a miscellany. Anyway, it came out. I didn't think too many people would see it, but the magic of the internet, I know it's a cliche, but it went viral. On day 3, actually, and within a few weeks, 100,000 people had looked at it, and at this point, well over 1 million. What's interesting is that it's kind of been, after that initial push, it's kind of been a steady, so it's, sort of 10,000 a month, so it seems to have been circulating as kind of samizdat among selective college students. And the reason I think that many of those readers are selective college students or recent graduates or sort of late high school students who are heading in that direction is that I've gotten a lot of emails in response. I started to get them right away. And they were almost always from that population. and almost all of them said some version of, thank you for putting this into words, thank you for expressing what I've felt, or thank you for saying in public what me and my friend have been talking about at Cornell, at Northwestern, whatever. Students also started to invite me to talk on campus, students and professors, but a lot of student groups. So over the years I've given, 15, 20 talks at mostly at selective campuses. And I've learned a lot from that, but one of the things that I've learned is that, the question that was most often asked me was some form of, what do we do about this? What do I do about this? What do we all do about it? What should schools do about it? So, in addition to the critique, in addition to the no, there's now a yes. My idea about what college should be and how students should negotiate it. So the subtitle of the book's called Excellent Sheep, which was a phrase that came from one of my students here. And the subtitle is The Miseducation of the American Elite and the Way to a Meaningful Life. And the first half of that subtitle is the no, and the second half is the yes. And it came out a month ago, and here we are, we're off to the races.
Great. Okay. Well, let's talk about the no first, and then the
Sure.
yes. So the no. So first of all, can you just elaborate on what the disadvantages are? Taking your first title.
Sure.
What is the basis of the notion of disadvantage that you're mobilizing here, and maybe also, can you talk about it in historical terms? Like if we're in a crisis, what is the trajectory? What's the narrative of that crisis? Where does it start? What are the breaking points? And why, I guess, at the end of the day, I want to know why you think that you've hit such a nerve with this, with these ideas.
It's called the disadvantages because the advantages are so obvious. Everybody knows what the advantages of an elite education are, and they think they know. But, it sets you up in life. That's the advantage, and that's why everyone is rushing to do this. There are a number of disadvantages, but I think fundamentally they stem from the admissions process and from the kind of person that students are shaped to become in order to succeed at the admissions game. What happens in college really is just about not disrupting. It's not, most of my complaint about the colleges is the admissions process that they superintend. So it makes students into excellent sheep, as my students said. They're world-class hoop jumpers, checklist completers. They learn to be great at being students, which means right now doing all the things, because you have to do everything. And they know perfectly well what that entails. However much professors or teachers or parents may ingenuously or disingenuously mislead themselves about what it involves. The kids know perfectly well. And it involves the inculcation of an enormous cynicism about education. Education is a game. It also means that you never get to go very deeply into anything because you're doing so many different things. And the final thing it means, and this is the sheep part, I think I explained the excellent part there, is that they're always doing the things that they know the adults want them to do. And the trouble starts when they have to start figuring it out on their own. And that's where I see the connection between what happens before college and what happens after college, or late in college, which is, they start to see the end of college and they think, what am I going to do? And they tend to take the easy answers. They tend to take the paths that are laid out for them. And that means generally the big four professions now, law, medicine, finance, and consulting, now account for around 50% of graduates from Ivy League institutions, depending on the, and generally speaking, from what people say, people do those things because they can't think of anything else to do, and they're obvious material rewards. Now, where does all this come from? To me, the narrative is very clear, and I talk about this in the book. We used to have this aristocratic system, the feeder school, prep school thing, and we made we made a big change. We moved to meritocracy, and that meant grades and scores. And there's actually quite a bit of overlap from the old system, like all the extracurricular interview, all that stuff was kind of maintained. And it's really been the same system for the last 50 years. I'm very adamant about saying that this is not a phenomenon of the last 10 years. This is not about kids today, this is not about millennials. Part of what's happened as I've written the book is that I've come to understand my own experience better and better, and how the system, I graduated from high school in '81, was the same system but in embryonic form. 3 APs and 3 extracurriculars. Now it may be 8 APs and 11 extracurriculars. So there's no, and there's sort of various milestones. The debut of the U.S. News rankings in '83 was one big one, but there have been others that have just increased the craziness. But there's no, there's it's just, really it's just worse. It's just the cycle is spinning faster and faster. Uh-huh. I think that this is resonating. My argument is resonating because students feel they sort of get it, and I think, listen, I think it's very natural for young people to want to think about something more than just getting a job. And even when it comes to thinking about getting a job, to feel that what they're going to do in life has some kind of meaning or purpose. And I think they all, or many of them, sort of get, have this idea that college is going to be about something more. And in fact, they'll often, I've often heard kids say, several times, either late high school or very early college, saying like, now, once I get to college, then I'll really be able to start to learn. And then they find out that that's not true. It could be true, but it's very difficult to interrupt the cycle. So they're hungry for, not necessarily for my ideas, but just to talk about this stuff. It's really, when I do an event, it can often kind of be this, on campus, it can often be this kind of cathartic experience. And there's never an opportunity to think about this stuff. There's never an opportunity to talk about this stuff. The very terms in which we can talk about it don't seem to be available to them because, there's really never been time for them to stop. It's really just kind of crazy. Ridgewood, New Jersey, which is an upscale suburb, has this, I don't know if they do it anymore, but they started this voluntary day off from everything, and other towns have emulated it, but it's a day off, it's not a day off a week, it's a day off a year. Like one day with no homework, one day with no club meetings, sports, practices. And even then, a lot of kids don't do it. So when I say there's no time, I really mean there's no time. And I think, I don't think things have reached a breaking point. I don't, this could have resonated 5 years ago or 5 years from now. But, and there's, people have disputed this a lot, and I don't have as complete a set of statistics as I'd like to have. But there's a lot of evidence that mental health issues among these kids are getting worse and worse and worse. So they're under an enormous amount of strain, enormous amount of pressure. And
from age 14, 15?
Have you heard of the movie Race to Nowhere? Mm-hmm. The woman who made that movie, I've talked to her, she's a lawyer, and she first started her journey to making the movie when her fourth grader, not 14, what does that mean? He was 10 or 11? Her fourth grader was having stomach aches from the pressure. Yeah, so. Yeah.
So now, in the kind of narrowest focus of what you're saying, you seem to be describing a kind of collusion between high school placement departments and college admissions departments. And that's the kind of wingnut in
Well,
in the crazy, right?
Yeah, but you forget the most important piece of it. It's the parents.
The parents, okay.
The parents.
So that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to kind of broaden out a little bit and talk about, in preparation for the yes part of the book. I mean, can you kind of setting that in the broader context of the culture at large and the other players in this equation, before we talk about what interventions are even meaningful or make sense here.
Right. Well, I mean, there are certainly, larger social and cultural factors.
Is it more pronounced on the coasts?
Yeah, it seems to be more pronounced on the coasts. I mean, basically, the same areas of the country, the blue state, the upper middle class. I mean, I'm going to be speaking to a very large group of parents on the North Shore of Chicago. I have a friend who teaches at the best private high school in the St. Louis area. So it's the coast, but it's the coast in quotation marks, right? Okay. There are certainly larger cultural and social factors. The winner-take-all society, the decimation of public higher ed, which is making people feel more and more like they need to get their kids into one of 10 schools. The increasing hegemony of material values. I mean, the age of the meritocracy is also the age of Reaganism or neoliberalism. Everyone's competing for the same rewards and the same narrow set of rewards. The percentage of students, college freshmen, who say that being very wealthy is important. Very wealthy, very well off, not just well off. It's gone from like 37% in the early 70s to 80% in 2012. I'm not going to say the financial collapse, because I don't know that things have gotten that much worse since the financial collapse. Well, maybe in some respects, but I mean, my initial article came. I wrote it in the summer of 2007. That was sort of the height. Everybody thought this would last forever. Although it certainly hasn't helped. I mean, families feeling the financial pressure. But all of this has gone along with this increasing idea that college is about getting a job and nothing else. And so this increasing move to practical majors. I was using air quotes because I think especially at highly selective colleges, it doesn't matter what you study. And in fact, there's article after article based on survey after survey of corporations that say that it doesn't matter what you major in, but people think it does. So people aren't majoring in humanities anymore, but they're also not majoring in basic sciences. It's not STEM fields, it's really just the technical fields, right? There are no very few pure math majors anymore. There are very few physics majors anymore. So it's computer science, economics, engineering. Yeah, those are some of the larger frames here. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
So, so again, before we talk about the yes part, this book has created
a bit of a stir.
I was going to say firestorm, but okay.
Yeah.
Which is a great thing for the book.
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit about the nature of the pushback? Where it's coming from? What are the arguments and where they're coming from? And maybe even go ahead and front load your response to the criticisms as long as you have the microphone.
Yeah. Well, a lot of criticisms. I'm biased. I don't think too many of them are very cogent. I think a lot of them are driven by defensiveness.
On the part of?
Oh, well, for one thing, the excerpt, an excerpt was published in the New Republic, and the New Republic they really put the excerpt together based they put it together as really kind of a collage, and they selected the title and the imagery for maximum inflammation. It came out in the middle of July, and so summertime, publications had a lot of Ivy League interns hanging around their office, and they let them make the response. So a lot of these came from Yale students or one student at the University of Chicago, or even, there were two extremely dismissive and I think misguided pieces in the New Yorker, one in response to the excerpt and one a review of the book, and they were both written by fairly young graduates, one of Harvard and one of Princeton. There have also been responses from faculty like Steven Pinker, the Harvard professor, Anthony Grafton, who wrote the New York Times Book Review, which was generally, I think, fair and positive, but he still felt that I got it wrong about the typical student. So, defensiveness on the part of people who are highly identified with the academy. When I did the Harvard event 2 nights ago, it was, 3 deans and 3 professors, more or less, on the panel, and I think a very high level of defensiveness. A lot of the attacks have been ad hominem. This is sour grapes because I didn't get tenure. I'm a hypocrite because I have Ivy League credentials myself. I criticize privilege, but I'm privileged myself. I forgot what I was going to say. Oh yes. This is just a game that the elite plays with itself, where it criticizes the Ivy League but doesn't mean it. So that's one. I could respond to those. I don't really think. My ultimate response to the ad hominem attacks, based on that go to my motives, is that it doesn't really matter what my motives are. I mean, I could defend what my motives actually are, but it doesn't matter. What matters is whether what I'm saying is true.
Right.
Now, another big line of attack is that I don't have the evidence to back up what I'm saying. To which I would respond that in a lot of many of the issues that I discuss are susceptible to statistical measures, and I try to provide them, like socioeconomic stratification or the percentage of majors, the most popular major. And then some of them aren't, and so there are no statistics aren't available. But so then my evidence is all the people who've written to me, who've talked to me at campus events, the fact that there have been some of the stuff I'm writing about has been written about before. Mm-hmm. It's almost like some people criticize me because some people say that I'm wrong, and then some people say, well, we know all this already. So obviously it can't both be true. But, Harry Lewis, the former Harvard dean, Ross Douthat, the New York Times columnist, who's a former Harvard student who wrote a memoir about it, David Brooks, the organization kid. A lot, in fact, I think I say new things in the book, but what I really think is new about the book is that I'm connecting dots in a way that people haven't before. Because I'm talking about the students, and I'm also talking about the parents, and I'm also talking about the schools, and I'm also talking about our leadership class that this whole system has produced.
Right. The criticism is interesting to me because, it's surprising.
It's surprising?
In a way it is, only because you can look any which direction and find someone talking about the crisis in education. So it seems as though it's a different take, it's a different angle of vision maybe, but it certainly is addressing things that are very much in the air for faculty, administrators,
right.
Students. And so...
But I'm not sure that too many people have criticized the elite schools, right? Yes, people say there's a lot of crisis in education talk about K through 12, about college.
Well, certainly in the state system and the collapse and the kind of depending on how you want to put it, but either the reconfiguration of the bargain or maybe the evisceration of the bargain between the public sector and the private sector over how research is going to get done in this society, right? There are all kinds of different ways that one might frame what the crisis is, or different places within the kind of chain to focus on. But what you're saying seems to me to kind of fit with all of it. So that's what I mean by
I think it fits with a lot of it. Yeah. And many of the criticisms that I make about the colleges, I really only have one chapter out of 12 about the universities as such, not the admission system, not students, but how universities conduct themselves. And in that case, I'm quoting Harry Lewis on practically every page, and about the tension between research and teaching, the mutual non-aggression pact between professors and students. You know, the other obvious difference between my book and previous books is that my book is actually getting attention. Mm-hmm. And so it's not simply, I mean, there are a million books about higher ed written by higher ed professionals for people within higher ed that are either read or not read. But for the laundry to get washed in public, you know, I mean, the people at Harvard, these deans and senior professors, spend a lot of energy trying to convince me that Harvard really cares about teaching. I mean, I can't exactly argue with them except to say, you know, you should tell everybody else because nobody actually thinks that, including people who've been here. So this is what I mean when I say just the very fact that the argument has gotten a lot of publicity, I think, you know, raises a lot of defensiveness. Uh-huh. Can I go? Yeah.
Please.
This is one of the biggest and most surprising and most disturbing criticisms, and I'm thinking of the New Yorker pieces and some others. Let's say, for the sake of simplification, that I'm saying that the Ivy League and its peer institutions don't provide a real education, or don't do enough to provide a real education, which means something more than just technocratic professional training. The response, some people, the response by and large has not been, yes, they do, although there's been a little bit of that. It's been, who wants a real education anyway? I mean, don't be a sucker, man. You know, this is the 21st century. People go to school to get a good job. And all this stuff is just, you know, it's either medieval, which was Joshua Rothman's argument in the New Yorker, or it's the 60s, which was Nathan Heller's argument in the New Yorker. Of course, they can't both be true. I'm sort of continuing to assemble, as I obsess about these criticisms, I'm continuing to assemble a bigger and bigger picture argument. And I think what I've arrived at is, you know, Rothman's argument is that, you know, what I'm really complaining about is modernity. Modernity is this, you know, increased acceleration, and this is students are just sort of being modern people now, and they don't have time to sit under a tree and think about themselves. And what I really think, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to ask, is in that construction, is modern different from corporate?
I'm not sure what he would say about that, but I mean, he starts his examples of modernity back with Baudelaire and Tolstoy. So, which has many, many problems in terms of the actual history of higher education, but no, I don't think he would say, I mean, maybe industrial. Okay. You know, all the acceleration. I mean, modernity. I mean, the acceleration is an aspect of modernity. There's no question about it. I mean, I have specific. I mean, I have other answers, but that I could give. But my leading thought is, this is not modernity, because another aspect of modernity is sort of romantic youth, right? Youth as rebellion, youth as a time. I mean, that's a modern phenomenon. So what he's really urging is postmodernity, which is to say a neoliberal self. You are your ability to earn in the market and to spend as a consumer, and either demanding or pointing out or excusing the fact that the neoliberal youth means, neoliberal college means preparation for that.
Right. So the atomization of the university is fine because we're preparing kids for an atomized world.
That's kind of what he says. It's either him or Heller or both who say, like, you know, yeah, I mean, I think Heller's the one who starts with a story of himself falling asleep on his notebook in the Harvard Library and waking up with, like, the spiral markings on his cheek and just like, yeah, you know, you're going to have to, you know, run like a hamster when you're an adult. So you might as well learn to start doing it in college. You know, to which I would say, like, maybe we should have third graders, you know, have jobs because that will prepare them for the workforce. Yes.
You didn't, I think Newt Gingrich actually proposed that a couple of years ago. But, okay, I'm still angling forward towards the yes part in the policy prescriptions, right. But one more stop along the way. What is your sense? So the university that you're describing in 2005 to now, to 2007, I guess you said 2007, 2014, is it basically the same university that you feel that you inhabited in the early 1980s, or are there significant differences in that interim period?
I don't think the university is that different. I think, my rubric is not the university so much as the student.
Mm-hmm.
My focus. I've already described how it's the same but worse. And I would, from what I can tell, with universities, it's the same but worse. Almost all of the trends that people talk about in university life really date from the 70s, but are worse, whether it's the adjunctification of the professoriate, or the corporatization of research, or the invasion of the management mentality into university administration, the chipping away at tenure, the chipping away at shared governance. Maybe globalization hadn't started quite yet, but it's obviously just the latest manifestation of many of these things. The overseas campuses and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. So, and also I was an undergraduate then, so what did I really know?
Right.
But
your perspective now. But different by degree, but not by kind.
I don't see that.
Yeah.
Do you?
No.
Okay.
I was just curious.
Yeah.
Okay, so now to your
yes
propositions for meaningful intervention.
A lot of the book is aimed at individual students because they can't wait for the adults to get their act together. So I try to outline what my vision of what should happen to a student in college. And I try to be careful to say, but of course you can never say this enough, I'm not saying you shouldn't worry about job and career, but you can do more than one thing, and in fact these things are related. How do you find a sense of purpose? How do you find your way? I don't necessarily, I keep updating my formulas, so I don't necessarily say this exactly in the same way in the book, but don't think of your education as getting from point A to point B. You are the thing that's going to change. This is about you becoming someone that you could never have envisioned becoming when you were 18, and maybe doing something that you could never have imagined when you were 18. College is about learning how to think. Schools already say that. They tend to mean it in an analytic way, sort of acquiring the intellectual skills to be a successful professional. And that's fine. In some ways that's what the liberal arts, in their proper definition, are about. Liberal arts is the fields where knowledge is created and pursued. But there's a deeper purpose, which is about thinking about yourself, which really means learning to identify and question the assumptions that you got to age 18 with, about the world, about what's important to you. And everyone has to do this for themselves. And I think there are two big things that can help you. And one is the humanities, because the humanities are sort of the human species' collective act of self-reflection, individual acts of self-reflection that you can use to model your own. And then the other thing are teachers in their role as mentors and guides who can just listen and ask questions that help elicit your own, desires or values or whatever, right? And whenever people talk as if this is this crazy idea, this utopian idea, and they tend to seize on the word soul, which I use, but I actually use the word self more, but they always seize on that because, of course, that's ridiculous. I say to them, first of all, there are schools where this actually happens. It happens everywhere. The question is how hard or easy is it? It even happens at Yale, but you have to work for it. You have to even fight for it. There are schools, and I think the liberal arts colleges tend to be like this, and I'm also including the public honors colleges, where this is much. It's just set up to help you to do this. There's more. We can talk about how and why. And then the other thing is, so in a synchronic way, this is happening elsewhere. This assumption that the Ivy League must give you the best possible education because it's the most prestigious is simply not grounded. And then also diachronically, right? This isn't the 60s. This isn't the 19th century gentleman's education. This has been the basic idea of American college since American colleges were founded as colonial institutions, that it's something, they used to say character. David Brooks, in his response to me and Pinker, says moral education. I mean, neither of those rubrics are my favorite ones, but the rubric would have been citizenship, really.
Yeah, I was going to say that. I mean, someone like Jim Sleeper talks a lot about civic republicanism and the centrality of the university to that kind of broader political project.
Yes,
despite the
fact that Jim Sleeper hates me and we have this poisonous personal history that he refuses to acknowledge, we really, we agree about that. And part of the narrative, the sort of mistaken anti-me narrative or anti-my ideas narrative, is that this was 19th century aristocrats who could, afford to do this. But once the mass middle class started to go to college, they just wanted jobs. And in fact, first of all, when we started to really build public higher education during the Civil War, the notion of liberal arts came right along with it, right? Which is why we have English departments. So we could have a humanities curriculum for people who didn't learn the classical languages. And then it did culminate in the 60s. But the 60s were precisely the heyday of mass public higher education, right? I mean, if all these working class and middle class kids were in college in the 60s, why was the English major at its most popular then? Because they wanted that kind of education too, or enough of them did. So it's really neoliberalism. It's really us that's the exception. This is not some kind of pipe dream. This is what we used to have.
And so thinking about those last 30 or 40 years in the history of higher education, where do the so-called culture wars come into these shifts that you're talking about? These shifts in perception.
That's a good question. I avoided anything like that in the book. Partly I just didn't want to get into all that anymore. Partly it just wasn't something I was thinking about very much. You probably know Christopher Newfield's book, where he says the culture war was, basically it was for the sake of destroying public higher education. I'm not sure I believe that, although it might have been used as an opportunity to do that. Well,
because I mean,
go ahead.
I
mean, I think the humanities have not helped their cause. I think the Left Academy has not presented what the humanities can do for society and for the individual in a way that I identify with, and certainly in a way that's going to make people want to support it. I think what actually happens in the classroom is a lot closer to what I like than what I think you might think happens in the class. I mean, I think people tend to be much more humanistic in the classroom than they're willing to admit. I'm thinking of Frank Lentricchia's great recantation. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. He was one of the big theory stars in the 90s. He was part of the Duke department that Stanley Fish assembled. And he wrote what became, in the little village, it was a confession recantation in one of the early issues of Lingua Franca about how he secretly loved books, even though he felt that he had to pretend to hate them, and how when the door of the classroom was closed, he really let himself and his students love the books. And you know the novel Cat's Cradle, mm-hmm. and how everyone on the island is secretly a Bokanist, even the king? That's kind of how I feel about humanism in literary studies.
I've always felt that, under whatever guise you want to call it, multiculturalism or whatever the thing is, that phenomenon in education between the 80s and now, it always became best known to the world in the renditions produced by its enemies. And so the truth of what those practices actually were has never had a full hearing.
That may be true.
I mean, I think that the Lentricchias of the world are multitudes. I mean, there are all kinds of people who would say that in the classroom what they actually do doesn't fit at all the description of what the so-called left academy has become.
Right. That may be true, but if it is true, it's partly their fault. Because
that's what Claire Potter says, right? That the universities are now being hoisted on the petard of their own failures to really communicate what it is that they do.
Yes, I was thinking also more specifically of the fact that one of the sort of constitutive features of left cultural studies is an impenetrable prose style. And listen, if you go out of your way to write in a way that only your colleagues can understand, then only your colleagues are going to understand you. You're not going to be a very good propagandist.
I don't. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
No, I agree.
Maybe so. I mean, Homi Bhabha, right? He was the moderator of my talk at Harvard. He's famously incomprehensible.
So, okay, let's go back though to the question of neoliberalism and citizenship, and to your policy prescriptions. What are some of the other things you would
okay.
I mean, how
okay.
do we heal these kind of rips in the fabric of both the university itself, but also the society?
Right. So the largest historical structure of the book says, we made this shift from aristocracy to meritocracy, and here's why it happened, here's how it happened, and now we need to do it again. Because the meritocracy has become a hereditary meritocracy, it's become a new aristocracy. So we need to do the two things that they did. We need to reform selective private college admissions, so we're getting a different kind of student. But more importantly, we need to build first-rate, low or no-cost public higher education. And I mean, I think the second is by far the more important one. And I don't do this in any kind of, I don't suggest that we do this in any kind of subtle or politically savvy way. I mean, it's just, you just send the tanks right up to the fortifications, which is raise taxes on the upper middle class, pay for public higher education. It sounds crazy, it sounds like it'll never happen, but I think the one thing that's predictable about the future is that it's not predictable. And I also think, I don't know if we've reached a tipping point or a new progressive era. I know the new progressive era has been proclaimed at least 3 times since 2008 and has yet to arrive. But I think inequality is on the table in a way that hasn't been before. And I take heart, especially from what seems to be a strong and sustained movement to raise the minimum wage and to unionize certain service workers, right? Certain very large sectors of the service economy. And I think that public higher ed, and actually K through 12, basically equalizing funding, making it federalizing funding rather than local, should be on the agenda. And there are people who've been trying to put it on the agenda. In the second case, people have been talking about it for a while. And in the first case, free public higher ed, there's an organization called Redeeming America's Promise that just started a year ago. I talked to the guy who founded it. He's no political hand. He worked for Gore and he's worked for other Democrats. It seems impossible. Raising the minimum wage also seems impossible. One good thing about both agenda items is that they can be done state by state and maybe even locale by locale without having to get Congress to sign off. But that shift from meritocracy to aristocracy, which I think, from aristocracy to meritocracy, which really was triggered by the crash of '29, and Conant at Harvard really started during the Depression, because I think he recognized there was a crisis in the WASP aristocracy. So, '29 started it. Brewster didn't finish it until 35 years later here at Yale. I think 35 years is probably a reasonable timeline for this. But it's only even going to happen in 35 years if we start. And, I think that answers your questions. Obviously, the idea that this could ever happen is premised on the idea that we will recover a notion of collective responsibility and citizenship and putting the common interest ahead of the private interest and the class interest and the family interest. But that's it. We need to do that for everything, right?
Yeah.
You're nodding. Let the record show that you're nodding.
Well, this has been great. Thank you. Is there anything that we haven't discussed that we should have?
No, I mean, we can say that MOOCs are a disaster and that online education is not going to, that's, well,
And that is just, is that kind of more neoliberalism, or is there something more to say about it? And what
it's more neoliberalism coupled with the delusion of technological salvation and the general American tendency to solve problems with technology rather than human beings. Unfortunately, there seem to be a lot of, this crisis talk in both K through 12 and higher ed is producing a lot of reforms, and the more powerful ones seem to be going in the wrong direction right now. Yeah, I don't know.
Okay. I have to ask you. I know what the answer is, but are you surprised by who has emerged as the new CEO at Coursera?
Who's the new CEO at Coursera?
Rick Levin.
Oh my God, you're kidding me. Well, that's perfect, because Benno Schmidt has been doing privatized ed for a long time too, right?
Maybe that's the place to stop. No, so now, but okay. Because you were speaking in such inspiring terms about, that 35-year job that we have ahead of us.
Yes, right.
Are you an optimist at all on this?
I'm not really an optimist about anything, but I actually want to get back to what I said before. I really do believe that the future is unpredictable. I mean, I believe this because I lived through the collapse of the Soviet Union and 9/11 and the rise of the Tea Party, and none of these things, black president, nobody thought any of this stuff was ever going to happen. So that's the basis of not optimism, but a refusal of pessimism.
Mm-hmm. Which is different, but important.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Okay, my pleasure. 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 Okay, my pleasure.